Balls out.
Slurs, rumors, innuendo.
Who do y'all consider the first American punk band?
Oh, there's no doubt in my mind. Well, I want to hear Bob's.
I don't know. It's hard for me to pick. It's either for me. It's either the MC5 or the Stooges.
So for me, the way I look at it, and I'm going to get into this in the podcast. Those two are part of there's a foundation, and to me, those two are part of it. The other two parts of the foundation is the Velvet Underground, and the fourth thing, and I'll tell the story about it. If you guys ever listened to Lenny Kaye's Nuggets compilations,
No, I haven't, but I'll check it out.
I'll get into that, and to me, that's the foundation of American punk. Between that stuff,
I'd agree with that. I'd absolutely agree with that. The Velvet Underground as well. I can't believe I forgot them.
When did these bands hit the scene?
Mid 60s.
Okay, so I think one of the earliest, and I'm not going to call them punk, although there are people who will. One of the earliest signs of punk in the mainstream might have been the Who, but they were probably getting it from.
Well, you can't use the Who because they're British.
Oh, that's true for American punk. Yeah, absolutely. Who's the first British punk band in y'all's opinion?
I think we ought to talk about that though, because there's a dynamic there of the mods and the rockers that pretty much describes the whole punk struggle. It's just called something different over here, like the movie The Outsiders, right? And that's what that punk has always been about. It's been a whole different thing that someone could relate to. And at times the personalities involved were bizarre.
The early Who albums, I think, start a lot of British punk because it wasn't conformist to like the British sound. I mean, they weren't the Beatles, they weren't the Stones, they weren't Jerry and the Pacemakers, they weren't Donovan, they weren't Hermits. They weren't even the Kinks. And the Kinks were even kind of weird. Like, they were on their own sort of plane. So that's why I always say, like, Live at Leeds, the Who Sing My Generation, that's the UK punk side of it.
Oh, the Happy Jack and stuff like that too, right? You can't explain, right? I mean, there's a blueprint there that's undeniable. In terms of American punk, though, I believe it was more far out in the beginning, and then eventually British punk became more far out. But in the beginning, the roots of American punk is far out, which I like.
And to me, I that the MC5, in the Stooges, in the Velvet Underground are huge. Like when you listen to Iggy Pop talk about it, like that was his. He wanted to be as visceral and as powerful as the MC5, and he was inspired by Lou Reed and influenced by Lou Reed because he felt Lou Reed couldn't sing, and he could have that sort of attitude.
Boy, I am so glad I jumped in the middle of this when we're talking about Lou Reed, because I've got opinions out the ass about that man.
Yeah, I wish you'd break them off on us.
Lou Reed is the most perfect example of being in the right place at the right time.
There's no doubt about
he
it.
owes every single bit to Andy Warhol and that whole collective that was hanging in and around the Chelsea and around the Greenwich Village and so on and so forth. That is the only reason that we all know who Lou Reed is.
Well, you also got to give Iggy Pop and David Bowie and Mick Ronson and Tony Visconti credit for the glam rock era of Lou Reed.
Oh, absolutely, and you're talking about some very iconic names in that grouping that you just mentioned. Just truly phenomenal musicians, and I'm sorry, but Lou Reed has never, ever, ever been one of those. However, I am a metal machine music apologist, primarily because I love a lot of ambient stuff. I love really weird. I'm a Captain Beefheart fan, so I just love really weird, off the wall stuff. And his experimentation on that album is actually when it first came out was, I mean, just dogged. Every single reviewer just gave him the absolute worst time with that album, and time has actually been a lot kinder to that album, probably more so than the rest of his catalog. Yep. And that was primarily because of what he was trying to innovate there, which wasn't really an innovation. I mean, you want to look at that sort of thing. Lennon was fooling with that. John Lennon was fooling with that a few years earlier.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, the final thing that I have to say about Lou Reed is Lulu. If any of you Metallica fans listening have never heard that album, and I'm sure that if you're a Metallica fan, you tried to give it a listen once, and joke's on you, buddy.
I like scotch and I like chocolate milk, but I'm not mixing them two together.
Yeah. And look, I'm not going to completely destroy Lou Reed. He has had some bright spots in his career, but there's never really been anything that. There's nothing about the Velvet Underground that is registered with me that had anything to do with Lou Reed. I'll put it to you that way, because he had some decent players there with him. Cale, for example, Nico. Then you also had Mo Tucker. I mean, come on, man.
Oh, yeah.
Again, yet another person who was in the right place at the right time, because she's an absolutely horrible drummer. Have you ever heard any of her solo stuff?
Yeah, it's bad.
Don't. If you haven't, don't.
Oh, I have, and I agree. I'm pretty much an apologist with it. Thing off, dog?
Who's walking down the interstate? Did you see a baby?
A baby.
Bob, did you fall asleep?
Kyle don't know about that baby bit. We had, I don't know if you've kept up with national news, but we had for a brief moment a young woman here in Hoover, Alabama, not very far from where I live. It's actually probably about 10 to 12 minutes from here where this incident happened. She apparently is driving down the road and calls the police and says that she sees a baby on the side of the interstate at night. And then she gets out of the car. She gets off the phone with police. Police say they're bringing somebody there. Then she gets out of the car and is on the phone with a family member. The family member says that they hear, or it's like her sister-in-law or something. Family member says that they heard her scream, and that's it. She left her purse there. She left her wig there, the car running, the whole bit. And then she reappears, 3 days later, and talking about she was abducted by somebody that looks exactly like Louis C.K.
Wow. And the baby was what, bait or something?
Actually, we're finding out that there was no baby. There was no Louis C.K. We're finding out about Google searches of taken and how much. This is one of the weirdest Google searches I've ever heard of. Somebody actually typed in Google, how much does a Amber Alert cost?
Wow.
That's a very specific search term for somebody that is randomly kidnapped 24 hours later, right?
Huh.
I got really pissy with Mitch McConnell about him sneaking that whole warrantless Google search thing in, and it failing by one vote. What was that, last year or year before last? But I don't know, man. Google definitely was the hero in this one, because had we not heard about the Google searches, police would still be wasting time looking for some sort of Louis C.K. kidnapper and some baby ring.
Louis C.K. Is that a comedian?
Yeah, Louis C.K.'s, her description that she gave of her quote-unquote abductor, which the whole story is one of the most fantastical sounding stories you've ever heard. It sounds like it was something taken out of a movie, like the movie Taken, which
Now,
she
what
also
Louis
searched that day that she got abducted. The movie
Louis
Taken.
C.K. on Madden 2003, he had like a song "Party Hard" or something like that was on Madden 2003.
No. You're thinking of Andrew W.K.
Oh yeah, that's something.
Yeah,
Sorry about that.
I love that guy. He's a joy.
Hell yeah.
Not the brightest, most intellectual music you've ever heard, but it's a lot of fun.
It's got a lot of energy, just like
It
punk.
does.
We're talking about punk now and energy, right? So
Energy sells, baby.
in the early days of punk, it may have been a little more esoteric, right? But then by the time you get to the Ramones, it starts having a lot of energy, and I really enjoy that. You know.
Well, and punk was really more. The energy was all part of the attitude. Energy, I think, was kind of a byproduct at first. You know, the loud and fast and aggressive. That's how these young men were living, and they had to talk about life on the streets. You know, I mean, really, you think about it, punk was the original gangster rap. It was gangster rap for English white dudes and dudes from New York.
A lot of people's going to call the Ramones punk, and they do have punk elements. But man, the Ramones were a pop band, in my opinion.
And the Ramones owe just as much to rockabilly and the roots and foundation of punk and all of the other rock subgenres that came after.
They could write the best fucking hooks. I'm still shocked that they didn't do any better than they did. Their first album is the only thing that really did anything.
24 hours a day. I want to be sedated.
They are just badass, and they do have punk elements, and you can call them punk, but they could write a pop hook like no other fucking band ever. In my
favorite part of the movie, The Royal Tenenbaums, if you've ever seen it, is when they go down the list of all of the Gwyneth Paltrow's character in the movie. It's very mysterious. And they actually hire a private detective to describe her life. And as her life is being played in little flashbacks, Judy as a punk is playing in the background. And man, I'm going to tell you, it totally sells that whole entire, 2 or 3 minute montage there. It really does.
Hell yeah. I love the Ramones, guys. I just can't help it.
I really do. But a lot of people, there's always going to be this debate about, where punk actually really started from and where it originated from. And, both England and Britain have laid some claims. Of course, I believe the focus that we're going to, or the topic that we're going to focus on tonight is more on the American side of the punk movement. And yeah, you can't, when you start about the beginning, or when you talk about the beginning, you've got to mention the Ramones. You've got to mention those bands that were at CBGB in New York and in the very, very early 70s.
That's the second phase to me of punk in America.
Well, and I kind of feel the same way too. Particularly with some of the things that were going on in Detroit with MC5 and Stooges, which predate the Ramones.
You also got to even look in the New York scene prior to Ramones, the New York Dolls.
Absolutely. Yeah. But then, we start casting our net that wide, and you then and we start talking about chronology and trying to figure out exactly who got there first.
You could get really obscure really quick with the punk genre, but I think when you keep it to like I was telling Doug earlier, to me the foundation of punk, like if we're gonna give it 4 like primary artists.
Where's ground zero? That I think that's where we need to start this conversation.
Everybody grab your balls. It's balls out, slurs, rumors, and innuendo.
You are listening to the Balls Out podcast.
您正在收听 Balls Out 播客。
We're going to have to go to England for that, though, right?
I don't think so. I think you got it right here in America. Because you look at, to me, Velvet Underground, the Stooges, the MC5, and the New York Dolls.
And again, and now bear in mind, we're keeping up with the time here, so we're talking 67, 68.
Yeah, but I would also throw one thing in here that really gave light to it. And I brought this up earlier. When Lenny Kaye did for Elektra the compilation Nuggets, that's where a lot of that early punk stuff is from the mid 60s on. You get the garage, proto-punk, and that punk stuff that never does it. And it's, I believe, where a lot of people say the term punk rock first appeared in the liner notes for it in
Hell yeah.
72. So I always tell people, if you really want to know kind of where punk began it from a granular sense, look up a lot of Lenny Kaye's Nuggets comps. You're going to find a lot of the foundations of the genre in there. A lot of bands throughout, the U.S. and they have some UK ones in there too. But you're going to find a lot in there.
Hell yeah. I'd have to agree with that. It was like the Soundhouse tapes in the late 70s, early 80s, where Iron Maiden and Saxon and some of those bands got discovered, and then later on it was like a cult thing, and if you could get your hands on it, it was a big deal, Like they passed tapes of it around like the Grateful Dead, bootlegs of the Grateful Dead, that is.
So I want to ask, I own 3 core albums by the Stooges, the self-titled first album, Funhouse and Raw Power. Does anyone have a favorite amongst those 3?
Raw Power. Raw Power.
I'm going to actually agree with you there, Shannon. I always get torn between Raw Power in Stooges, but I've been more into Raw Power lately. What attracts you to Raw Power?
That.
Yeah, I had to readjust, Bella. Sorry.
Sure.
Yeah. That what a powerful record that is. And I mean, really, that a lot of people have laid, because MC5 had shades of punk. The Stooges were punk. I mean, let's I think there is a distinction there. I really do. And a lot of people tend to blur the two of those because, again, they're from.
Yeah, Detroit is such a seminal place for rock and roll and the development and the moving forward of rock and roll. And then you have Motown too. There's so many flavors there, right? And so many great musicians, that's coming out of Detroit. And they, I'm sure them guys are trying to do something.
God, we lost Bob.
Right.
There he is.
Oh,
we lost you.
Oh, I'm sad about that. It must be my cell phone service must not be the greatest.
It must be Windstream. Windstream has shitty internet service, and I think that's going to be a reoccurring theme on the show.
That's right.
Shit on the interstate. It don't matter. Windstream's fuck.
I'm gonna go on a limb here. I might trigger Doug in a way here. Shannon too. But I often find the Lennon and McCartney of punk being Iggy Pop and James Williamson of the Stooges. I think they are the best punk writers in my opinion.
Of that era or overall?
I think overall. I mean, Patti Smith gives them a run for their money for sure, but I really, really like those two together.
Now, are the Pretenders punk, or were they ever punk?
I consider them more.
Yeah, I never really got why people were trying to lump the Pretenders in punk. Sometimes you have some folks that I don't know, because people are in and around a certain era. The grunge era. You had a lot of bands from Seattle in and around that time, and when you start trying to determine or put your finger on what exactly constitutes grunge, some of those bands get left out.
Well, here's the reason that I brought up the Pretenders. There's a line in the song Back on the Chain Gang where they said that the powers that be will fall to ruin one day, right? And that's an important line to me because I'd like to see that personally, right? So to me, that's a punk sentiment, at least in one song of the Pretenders,
And they did kind of get labeled as punk too, even though I don't really feel that they were punk either. But there were some punk elements, especially early on. But they were kind of, if I'm not mistaken, Chrissie Hynde was American, and the band was always British, no matter who they ended up.
I consider the Pretenders punk claim the same as when Bono said, "Hey, we were punk for a minute too" for the Boy album. It's just They were it for a cup of coffee, but I wouldn't necessarily consider them punk.
I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that. And then other bands were trying, a lot of different things in that vein in the mid '70s, and a lot of it influenced metal as well. As a metal fan, which was always, I wouldn't call it competition, but in opposition to punk, right? You kind of watch the punk thing evolve, and it eventually got more and more aggressive. And I found that very interesting that it become more and more aggressive. I mean, if you push forward a little bit to the Misfits, I mean, it was extremely aggressive.
Let's rewind before the Misfits, because that's when you get really aggressive. The whole CBGB scene is very, very important, because I think when you hit the Misfits, they're the tail end of that scene, because they're from Lodi, New Jersey. You got to get to the beginning of CBGBs. You got to talk Patti Smith Group. You got to talk Ramones. You got to talk Talking Heads before they went new wave and art.
Oh yeah,
you got to talk television. You got to talk about a fellow Lexingtonian. Who am I thinking of? Bob Arthur.
I don't know.
Richard Hell.
Oh, I've heard of him. But you lost me for a second.
Richard Hell and Boy Bond.
He's from Lexington, Kentucky.
Yes, he is.
Hell yeah.
So,
what about Wendy O. Williams?
The Plasmatics. Oh my God, yeah. Of course, we're working down the list. We're definitely going to get to her because, man, you cannot talk about American punk and not bring up Wendy O. Williams.
But
that's true.
When you look at the CBGB scene, I mean, Seymour Sire literally reinvented his label just from wandering into that New York bar. I mean, he signed Patti Smith, signed the Ramones, and then he found the Talking Heads there. And, we were talking Ramones earlier. Seymour Sire faced a lot of critics when he signed them, and he used to say, "Call me crazy, but I hear elements of the Beach Boys in there. I hear elements of like these pop ups," and that's what Ramones were good at. I've always said, I mean, they have one classic album, and that's their self-titled debut album. But when you get past that, a lot of their stuff's just solid. Like, I could listen to Rock and Roll High School over and over.
Yeah, I love Rock and Roll High School.
Yeah, it's good. Good album.
It's just good music. Did you guys ever dive into Patti Smith Group at all? That was one
Easter.
That outside
Easter is a monster album.
I've never jumped beyond Horses. I was one of the things I was going to ask you guys tonight is if you guys dived in, what was your biggest takeaways from Patti Smith?
Oh man, some of the biggest brass balls that you could possibly imagine. Now again, Patti also got to enjoy geography and some of her playmates at that time. Coming up in and around New York, had a lifelong friendship with Robert Mapplethorpe.
Yep.
The legendary New York photographer. But and of course the one song that really strikes me, I can't mention the whole entire title. The most controversial of her songs, which is a massively monster tune, both with the actual construction of the song and lyrical content. It just, man, it hits you from all directions.
And I want to go ahead and while we're talking,
massive influence too.
While we're talking about her, I want to go ahead and mention that I brought her up last week, the last show we did. She punched Ted Nugent in a radio station. He grabbed her arm or something, and she knocked the shit out of him. You can actually hear the audio of this.
And he was being playful with her, but at the same time, it was, being playful with her like the old businessmen from the 50s,
Well, he said, I think what pissed her off is he basically said, "We could smell you coming several minutes ago."
Wow.
So, I mean, that's going to be offensive. Any woman is not going to like that.
You think he was referring to her private parts?
He didn't say, but knowing Ted, yes.
To me,
Wang Dang Sweet Poontang? Yeah. That's what Ted was talking about.
Good.
But anyway, that is classic, and it's never going away. There's audio of it, and I've heard. Did you check it out, Shannon?
I've dug into the story. I haven't actually listened to the official audio, but I did dig into the story. And it's funny you shared it to me, and I'd actually stumbled upon that last week.
It's in
when
the
we
Balls
were
Out
talking,
podcast.
when we had the conversation last week,
Yeah.
I went and checked it out. Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, that's one of the great radio moments of all time, in my opinion.
For me, kind of keep it in with the little bit of the New York scene and whatnot. To me, I think two artists that I don't want to say that it's underrated, because I think both these albums are, if you were to tell me these, what are like the cornerstone American punk albums, but sometimes for the casual, they always seem to forget these. And I'm going with Television's Marquee Moon and Richard Hell's Blank Generation. I think those are like seminal punk albums that often get forgotten about because they're not Ramones, they're not the Talking Heads, they're not.
Well, to be fair, not too many people are going to forget about Television's Marquee Moon, because that was, it's funny. They actually had a follow up to that album, and if you try to talk to any, what was it, Magazine or something like that, it was horrible.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't horrible. It was almost a completely different band almost.
Oh, it is.
They had some bright spots and flourishes on that album, but Marquee Moon is killer. All killer, no filler. From beginning to end, just such a magical album, and the guitars on that album. Oh,
to me, it was such a precursor for like punk being able to forge itself, and it was able to merge like garage punk, punk itself with like the art side of punk, and then what would eventually become new wave.
That album has just as much Patti Smith on it as it does Tom Petty, to be quite frank. It really does.
It's a seminal album, and I think, Rolling Stone has always had it like hover near the top 100. I mean, I'm not trying to make that as like the benchmark, but it's never forgot. But like when people talk, hey, what are like the great punk albums? People usually don't clump it in there, but they don't realize like that's a huge part of it. And then I just feel with Richard Hell's Blank Generation, oh my God, that is such a great record. I enjoy the hell out of it. I think they even did a movie too. I think it's fantastic.
Now I remember who you're talking about, because there's my introduction to punk was at the University of Kentucky, and a friend of mine's little brother was going to UK, and they was living in a house that had been broke up into like 8 apartments, and it was like all the rooms were open to each other and communal, and he was like the curator of the punk records, and that was their scene, and nobody could touch the records, only he could touch them and put them on. And then he had to catch you about whether or not they were punk or not punk, right? And those guys were laughing.
And I always tell people like the New York Dolls had a very fashionable impact on Sex Pistols fashion, but the one that really had a big impact on it was Richard Hell. And Malcolm McLaren will be the first one to tell you he was just always amazed at how he would show up on stage and whatnot. He wasn't afraid to just go after things. I always tell people, just listen to Blank Generation. Actually, listen to the whole second side of Blank Generation. I mean, they do a great, I think it's a CCR cover of Walking on the Water. I know John and Tom Fogerty wrote it, but it's Blank Generation is so good. And if you can find the deluxe edition, you won't go wrong. The alternate takes are fantastic.
I'm gonna look that up tonight.
Yeah, we gotta check it out.
Okay, so we've covered pretty much the genesis, the ground zero, the late 70s, and now we're moving into the very end of the 70s. where punk and disco are challenging the normal, stuff that's on the radio. Suddenly, disco finally gets it up the butt over at the big ballpark there, and all the records catch on fire. And punk, I don't know, punk never went away, obviously, because it's had many resurgences since its birth. But in the early 80s, you had a lot of different musical styles and musical genres that were taking over. Of course, you had, English punk bands and a lot of the English classic rock and this, that, and the other suddenly merged into this new thing that Black Sabbath had formed called metal. And, of course, that was eating the scene up over there. But in the early 80s, that second wave that came through, because obviously you have some punk bands that get lumped in with new wave bands, some new wave bands that get lumped into punk. And so how do we separate the wheat from the chaff here?
Well,
I go.
I look at when you get into the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, to me, the scene shifts from New York. I mean, the Misfits were like the last great of that band in New York. But for me, you get into California, you look at the LA and you look at the San Francisco scene. You have Black Flag, you have the Descendants, you have X, you got Dead Kennedys, you got Minutemen, you got Bad Religion, you have Social Distortion, Suicidal Tendencies, Germs, and the Circle Jerks. I mean, that you
Butthole Surfers.
Yeah, add them on there. I mean,
yeah, it's spread like punk finally spreads like a virus throughout the rest of the United States, and of course it catches on in L.A. because that's where the music industry is really camped out and really ground zero even to this day.
To me, when I think of the California scene, to me the two artists that always go to the top for me from that era is X and Dead Kennedys.
Jello Biafra, the song Holiday in Cambodia, which even to this day is a rather controversial song and a very controversial video. Oh my God.
Early 80s, and a lot of people, this is kind of odd, but a lot of people consider Motley Crue's first album, they consider Motley Crue almost a punk band.
Yeah, it's the same thing as like U2's first album.
Exactly, but it's... it has definitely been called punk by more people than
that always confused me too, and I'm a huge fan of early U2, particularly that first album. Boy, it's just
Anna who likes to spread that out.
But it's not. It definitely has a lot of a punk vibe to it, but it's not a punk record by any stretch of the imagination.
He kind of, I think, jokes more about it more than anything. I think of when Ray Manzarek, I believe, found X, and he found John Doe, who I think is up there with the great punk lyricists of all time.
Oh yeah.
Johnny Hit and Run Pauline is great, and just listen to Billy Zoom's like little guitar riffs are fantastic. To me, I tell anyone, if you want to know American punk, you want to get into that California scene, and for people that are just, and I have nothing against the Dead Kennedys. I mean, they deserve laurels that they get. But I say you go to X, pick up Los Angeles and Wild Gift, and you can thank me later, because those are absolutely iconic albums.
Hey, Doug, you remember Dan Sartain, don't you?
Yes.
He did the album Dude's Blood, which is highly recommended. Phenomenal album. The drummer on most of that album is actually DJ Bonebreak, which is X's drummer.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, how long's he been dead?
Ooh, I'm not opening that can of worms on the show.
Yeah,
because that right there, I am privy to, and actually a lot of us here in Birmingham are privy to information about Dan Sartain's death that the national media, for altruistic reasons, believe it or not, decided to skim over. A lot of people, they know he committed suicide, but nobody really knows exactly, or at least the national scene doesn't know exactly what happened, and it is a horrible story.
Yeah. Now with Dead Kennedys, that's hardcore punk. This is like like when you start getting in the Black Flag realm, and I kind of dabbled a little bit with the Dead Kennedys in my time there. What's the Fresh Fruit for Rotten Vegetables is, I think, an album I played to ad nauseum. I think half that album was on the Tony Hawk soundtrack. Plastic Surgery Disasters is another one, and those are really like it. I know I haven't had a chance to really listen to Bedtime for Democracy or Frankenchrist, but those two albums there, I listened to a good bit, and they are fantastic. I think it's like the hardcore punk that I can listen to before it gets too like, I don't want to say I'm softening at my old age, but it starts to get to be noise to me versus music.
One of my favorite bands from that second wave lived so far away from both New York and LA, and that was Minneapolis's Husker Du.
Oh,
Husker Du, yes.
Oh yeah.
Bob Mould is to me is still one of the most phenomenal guitar players that ever played punk.
Yes, he is. Oh, I'm so glad you brought him up. That was
well, you know, and I hate to say it, Husker Du is not my favorite Bob Mould project. My favorite Bob Mould project was the one he did in the '90s, Sugar, with Dave Barbie and Malcolm from Human Sexual Response drumming.
Yeah,
Hell yeah.
To me, Husker Du, I think they just influence this Midwest thing. I think you can hear direct influence to the Replacements from Husker Du.
Now, was Devo punk?
Yeah,
man. Yeah, that's still a tough one for me because I still listen to Devo on the reg. I just absolutely just love Are We Men.
Oh yeah, I love Devo.
I think Devo is half punk and half new wave. That's just my thoughts.
What about Bananarama?
I think that they have shades of both, but there's something completely other. And when they first came out, I can't remember. I want to say it was maybe an interview that David Byrne had did or something, but it was an interview done in and around that era when they first came out, late '70s, early '80s, and when they came out, people didn't know what to do with them. They were so instantly recognizable, yet at the same time so completely themselves. They're I'm sorry, man. Their cover of Satisfaction, I like it better than I do the Stones.
For me, when you get into the 80s,
it is so fucking tight. You ever catch a live performance of them doing that back in the day, man? That song, the way that they arranged it, and the way that everybody has to be so whip smart tight on it. I don't know what drugs they were taking to make them that smart. I mean, I know Coke will kind of help you in that regard, but oh my God. It is amazing. Their early performances are just jaw-droppingly tight.
Now, what about Bananarama? Were they punk?
No, come on, man.
I just had to ask.
Even if they were, we wouldn't talk about them because they're British.
Right. What about? You're right. What about Susie and the Banshees?
That's English. They're again another English band.
So, if we were talking about British bands, would we have to mention the Police?
Yeah, you would, because they would. Their early
they were
stuff
was British.
I think one of the best American, and I think for the genre from the '80s. I'm a big fan of the so-called sound. I love the ska punk movement. And Operation Ivy.
They were good band.
Operation Ivory's only album they ever did, I think it's called Energy. That to me is another album that I would say is a cornerstone seminal record for American punk. Such a great record. I can't even express really in the words just what that record means to me personally. It just was so different because it was able to blend so many different variants of punk and just bring a ska component. I think they influenced Rage Against the Machine. I know they're not punk, but but other artists like The Descendants. I think Sublime had some influence from them. and just countless others. They were very, very classic, in my opinion.
You know, we skimmed over one very important first wave band, which there are a lot of people that argue are actually predate the Ramones, and that's Bad Brains.
Well, Bad Brains, I was going to bring up the DC scene. That was, they got Bad Brains, Rock for Light, Eye Against Eye, Quickness, Rise. That's a huge statement from the early 80s there. Such a great.
Well, now Bad Brains stretches all the way back into the late 70s, I believe. As early, I believe they formed in 76 or 77. I can't remember.
I think they started as Mind Power, and I think you're right. It goes into the 70s, but like as Bad Brains out of DC, I think a lot of that stuff came in the 80s. But I mean,
but you know, here's the funny thing about that, though. You know who predates Bad Brains, which, you know, a lot of people also point to the fact that, you know, because again, they had black members, which kind of, you know, nearly every single band that we brought up tonight, just about every one of them, with a couple spots here and there, like the drummer for Dead Kennedys, were all white dudes.
Mm-hmm.
So they were definitely an anomaly in the scene right out of the gate. But the band Death, not the metal band Death, but the punk metal band from Detroit, Death, actually formed in 1976. Actually formed in 74, and didn't actually get around to recording until 76 or 77, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Yeah, I think, what was his name? Dennis Hackney?
I can't remember the fella's name. I've only recently...
A group of brothers.
I only recently came acquainted with their music, and if you've never heard of them, you've got to check them out. Google or you'll type in on YouTube a band called Death, and they actually had a documentary film.
Detroit, and they were hugely influenced by, I think, Alice Cooper and the Who, and you can hear a lot of that stuff.
Well, they're from Detroit, so I mean, there's not just Alice Cooper, but I mean, you also had just about every band from Detroit in and around there from MC5 on.
Hell yeah. Absolutely. And they it's just amazing how just
what's that?
Some of Alice Cooper's earliest stuff had a lot of punk elements too.
Well, it had a lot of other stuff going on there too. He was kind of all over the map on this first couple albums, first 3 albums really, until he started to solidify into what we know Alice Cooper as now. You know, the $1 Billion Baby's Alice Cooper.
Yep.
Yeah.
For me, a band that one of my absolute best friends got me into, and at minimum, they are a punk band for their Twin Tone years materials. When they got into Sire, you know, you could probably say they became more alternative, but you know, the Replacements, I mentioned them earlier.
Tim, that's a monster record.
Yeah, that's probably the last one you could consider punk, but in my opinion, but I will always, my favorite thing and what endeared me to Bob Odenkirk forever, he said something, he was like, you know, if he, in his last testament, he just wants to hear the Replacements, Sorry Ma, Forgot to Take Out the Trash, and just go from the planet Earth. That to me just made me just be like, I love Bob Odenkirk now, even like it's hard not to like him, but now this just put him in another stratosphere. But that one, and then to me, and I'm going to piss off Doug, I'm going to say the superior Let It Be album than the Beatles, Replacements Let It Be.
I have not heard that.
You never listened to the Replacements Let It Be album?
No, oh, sorry, that didn't cover the song then.
No, but it's almost just like the Beatles' Let It Be, except way drunker.
Yeah, if the Beatles were hammered, you would get.
Yeah, you got to tie one on before you listen to that record.
Now, what I have
it's
heard
almost required.
What I have heard the Replacements cover is Kiss Black Diamond, which I thought was odd.
Just put on Androgynous from Let It Be from the Replacements and just be like, wow, that's bad. But yeah, Black Diamond's off there. That's a great one. I mean, to me, Unsatisfied is an all-time classic.
I'll have to give that whole album a listen. I have heard Black.
Oh, I have it on vinyl and I have it on CD. And I have it downloaded on my phone.
Send Doug your vinyl copy. He's got a record player.
I can probably find this on Spotify, right?
Oh yeah. Not that out there. I would highly suggest, if you're ever want to watch a great music documentary, put on the documentary Color Me Obsessed. It's about the Replacements. It'll just blow one of the best music documentaries, one of the underrated ones. Put it on and you'll thank me later.
You are listening to the Balls Out podcast. Like, share, and comment after you subscribe, of course.
And Doug, for an accessible start for the Replacements, I would recommend to you, just because I know your musical taste, I'd recommend their last album, actually.
Yeah,
because I think it's a little bit more easily accessible to people that like different styles of rock. Because the production's also a lot better on that one as well. Big studio money.
Yeah. All Shook Down is probably where you want to start with, Doug. I would honestly, I don't know Doug as well as you do, but if you're going to start that late, I think Don't Tell a Soul might be a little bit better than All Shook Down. I think All Shook Down could be kind of, for some people, to turn off. Some people love it. I don't know. I know a lot of people just love Don't Tell a Soul.
Well, that was actually All Shook Down was my introduction to the Replacements, other than the occasional spin that I would hear on college rock radio from the earlier stuff.
And if you want, then you'll probably, Doug, when you want to get into their more, if they have a pop phase.
But work your way back to Tim, though, because Tim is such a fucking badass Balls record. I love it.
Tim is. We can argue back and forth between Let It Be and Tim. That's to me, the two best. And then Pleased to Meet Me has, I think, their most notable works, like Alex Chilton and Can't Hardly Wait.
Yeah.
All right,
killer. So we have moved through the 80s now. I believe we're talking about the Replacements. We're getting on into the late 80s and early 90s. We're getting dangerously close to pop punk as well.
Oh,
because that has to come up, because pop punk sold quite a few units, particularly in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah. So we're gonna have to talk Green Day, is what you're saying?
There's no way we can't. Particularly as many albums as Longview's, or not Longview, Dookie.
Before we sell our souls to talking about Green Day and Blink 182 and shit like that, and the Offspring as well.
I got to bring up my little cousins too. Good Charlotte. They got all off in the middle of that cash cow.
Can we at least talk about the Bouncing Souls?
Do it,
dude. I'm going to say this right now. If with the when skate punk, I always call Tony Hawk punk, because they're just on the games and whatnot. But these guys are just. I think they're a Jersey punk band. And they just gave that new punk flavor that I think like they're, to me, before you get into like Green Day and whatnot, they're good enough where like there's that edginess to them that, in my opinion, you have that punk stuff before you get into too poppy. But their sound is pretty good, and it has a nice flavor to it. I always tell people, if their second album, Maniacal Laughter, is fantastic. Their self-titled album, The Bouncing Souls, which is their third album, is absolutely fantastic. I think my favorite one is 2001's How I Spent My Summer Vacation. That the way they were able to bring melodic hardcore, and I think at that time they were going to tour with Green Day. To me, it's fantastic. I think it's where I consider the Bouncing Souls my like border band before I can't digest the pop punk stuff.
We're going
Hell
to
yeah.
rewind just a little bit and circle back around to DC because we skipped over a very, very massively influential band there in the late 80s, early 90s, and that was
You talk
Fugazi.
about Minor Threat.
Minor Threat, and then eventually Fugazi. Yeah, Ian MacKaye and company.
I feel bad for forgetting about Fugazi.
There's no way I can. In fact, I actually listened to a little bit of the argument earlier today. Because that's the argument which was released in 2001, and that is also Fugazi's last album. That is still probably one of my favorite albums ever. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one of my top 20 Take to the Desert Island albums, and it was Fugazi was a really slow burn for me. Primarily because the whole straight edge thing. I mean, I get it, but that's not really my thing. Me and Bob are down there, partying with Copenhagen cans down the front row. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So yeah, but I got it. I understood, the little movement behind it. Of course, it takes a couple little assholes to really fuck up a really good thing. But I have to bring up Fugazi because Fugazi also was a point in time in punk where the politics of what was punk and what was punking up was really, like Bob mentioned a minute ago, with his friend playing the albums there, and then he would pretty much get to dictate what was punking up, to be on his phonograph. We've seen this pop up in popular culture and movies and things like that because it's a discussion that when you start talking with truly hardcore punk fans, they start getting into what they consider punk and what their criteria for living that punk life is. And here we had something that was the complete exact opposite of that scuzzy punk life that Sid Vicious kind of immortalized with his death. And suddenly we have some kids that are, very politically conscious, almost, too much so, and really, really focused on health and all of these other things. It was really, it was a strange time. And of course, as Fugazi began to get a little bit more popular, I think they kind of gently gravitated away from that and focused more on the political issues of the day. Yep. But man, some fantastic musicianship there. And also too, a band that really, there's a huge debate about this particular band being punk as well, and that's Sonic Youth. Because Sonic Youth came from New York. They have the pedigree. Yeah. A lot of the same aesthetic, but also there was a lot of different things going on with them as well.
I will never doubt Sonic Youth. I consider them more alternative, but again, when I was doing my notes, I put down Sonic Youth ?
Yeah, I mean, but you listen to his first couple albums all the way up into really Bad Moon Rising. Well, I mean, you want to keep going on into their whole entire catalog. They still kept a punk aesthetic and a lot of their own, punk rules and punk terminology and stuff like that always has popped up in there. And they always gave homage to where they came from that New York punk scene. And also in and around the time of that debut album, another seminal New York record that came out, and that was Swan's Filth. Mm-hmm. Man, that is a dirty, nasty, dark, violent record. I love the Swan so much. Michael Gira, huge, massive fan. And of course now the music that they make is much more complicated and much, goes off into areas of, psych rock and things like that, but they, that first album, Filth, which correct me if I'm wrong, didn't Thurston Moore have something to do with that album? Or wasn't he playing with Swans at that time?
That I'm not sure of.
I want to say that there was a connection there between the two bands.
Okay.
Or Barry, we're talking about Barry early on when everybody's still jamming with everybody, kind of like watching Tommy Iommi play with Jethro Tull on Rock and Roll Circus. Yep. He just happened to be the guy in the band at that moment,
Now, guys, I have to bring up, I think that heroin use probably had a huge influence on punk.
Oh, there's no doubt about it, particularly when we talk about, Velvet Underground, which wrote, an homage to heroin and titled it heroin. Sonic Youth, that there's been a lot of, and see, the thing is that Sonic Youth, I think that might have been something they dabbled with when they were younger and started to see some of the things go down with the people around them, because that comes up in subject matter in a lot of their major label releases. There's more than several mentions of watching their friends go score and then kind of pretty much flush their life down the drain afterwards, as it were, in that kind of really strange kind of sideways way that Sonic Youth and Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon tell stories.
Yeah, and that's what brought it to my mind. Is the cost of that and the dealing with the fame and the how many of them are still with us and how many aren't. And
that's what I loved about Fugazi, because that was backlash against being in the scene and seeing all of these really talented, brilliant people just dropping like flies, because they believe this notion that in order to be punk you had to do the right drugs and be able to handle your drink and be able to party like a rock star like Mick Jagger and do all of this crazy stuff and still get up there and do your thing. And nobody could ever really not for a long extended period of time really be able to kind of catch that and hang on to it for very long. You have a few notable exceptions with Iggy Pop and hell the Ramones. I mean, that's some pretty good staying power. Jerry Only's still looking pretty buff. Talk about the Misfits.
Yep.
But but then you start talking about a lot of their other contemporaries, and Richard Hell's still popping around and
yeah, he is.
But but a lot of those guys are they've moved on. Bob Mould's still recording. That's my dog right there. Still playing with Dave Grohl every once in a while.
Damn.
Yeah, there's a really great clip I saw recently of them doing something, maybe at the Disney out in California. Dave Grohl and Bob Mould doing some old Husker Du songs.
Yep.
New Day Rising. Yeah.
Yep. All right. So what's left of punk right now today?
Well, I mean, we kind of just barely brushed over the pop punk, and that was really like a lot of other scenes, like when we did our episode the other day about hair metal destroying, kind of collapsing and getting destroyed by grunge. I think pop punk was really when you finally get your you've hung around the edges for long enough. We're going to go ahead and thrust you in the limelight. Pair you off with some, big high name producers, not Steve Albini, but, whoever's doing the Britney Spears thing at the moment. And we'll just go ahead and set y'all up. And really Green Day, which came out of nowhere, and that album was pretty good. We all owned a copy of it. But really, you go back and listen to it and the songs are fun and they're poppy, but there's nothing groundbreaking there. There's nothing groundbreaking there at all. It just kind of fit the aesthetic on the radio. It fit on the dial perfectly in between this song and that song that was going on in the early 90s.
And it
just kind of caught fire. And that's when suddenly Green Day reminded all the labels that, hey, this punk thing, you can make money with it. You just clean them up a little bit and,
For me, when we're talking today, and I'm talking last 20 years, there's been like a groundswell of like punk rock fusing with Heartland rock. So I think of artists like the Gaslight Anthem out of Jersey, and then I know he's English, but Frank Turner's another one that's kind of capitalizing on the scene, very much doing that. And like I said, one of my favorite records, and it was my one buddy Joe that kind of reintroduced me to the record. I remember getting it on a burned CD and it was like, wow, this is fantastic. And I just couldn't remember. I lost the CD, couldn't remember what it was. He reintroduced to me. I tell anyone, listen to the 59 Sound album by the Gaslight Anthem. It was released in 2008. It's absolutely fantastic. If you listen to the 10-year anniversary one, Miles Davis and the Cool sounds so much better. Frank Turner's one I've just got into recently, and I just think he's absolutely fantastic. I'm kind of jealous that my buddies got into them a lot sooner than I did, but absolutely fantastic.
And again, as far as American punk goes, there's, there's a lot of the post-punk bands that have come out in the past 20 years or so that have now recently decided to hit the road and see if they can't wring one last dollar out. I know Sunny Day Real Estate, which, you know, is a band that started off as a grunge band. They were a sub pop band, released the album Diary, and then, or excuse me, Seven, with the single Diary. That was their first single on that thing. And then accidentally on their second album, which was, there's a whole shamble of a process that takes place on that album, and they suddenly inadvertently helped birth the emo scene, which the emo punk and pop punk are very, very, very closely related. And young boys up there just, you know, to the punk beats and the punk swaying back and forth, you know, crying about some little girl that broke their heart, you know, which was really a place that punk had love songs before, but nothing to that extent. Yep. Where it really leaned all the way into the Whitney Houston territory. You know, I mean, it really did. You go back and again, I'm going to bring my cousins. My first cousins are Benji and Joel Madden from the band Good Charlotte, who is Benji is now Mr. Cameron Diaz. So they've enjoyed you know, the fruits of their labor. Their second album, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, which rips off so many great punk performances, did very well for them. Sold, I can't remember how, 4 or 5 million copies. So, and of course they got a show on MTV and all that other stuff, but that kind of, I'm only bringing that up, not because it's a flex, and, you know, I hadn't talked to these guys in 20 years since they came to Birmingham. They came to Birmingham, I saw their show, and that's the last time I've seen them face to face. So, you know, they're, it's not like we're all tight or anything. I wasn't invited to Benji and Cameron's wedding. But, yeah, that's really, and of course, Blink-182 was ruling the charts. You had bands like, you know, Newfound Glory and, you know, those bands of that ilk, you know, that we remember, you know, nothing, again, just like when Green Day dropped, there's nothing salacious there. And actually the edge is worn off even more. And the sound gets more polished, and there's more guitars in the background, and there's big swelled up anthems now. And, you know, there's just, you know, just this whole Hollywood production that's added on and slathered on top of it now. And so it's hard to take a lot of it seriously, you know, except for bands like the one you just mentioned a moment ago, Gaslight Anthem, you know, a band whose musicianship and dedication to the scene, I guess you could say, shines through. You know, these kids they started off in the scene, but, you know, once they got in there and looked around and looked at all the expensive stuff they can buy with this big pop music money, yeah. Definitely just start thinking about girls and cars, and, you know, let's not worry about, you know, the downfall of the government, or, you know, how the authority is trampling upon us, you know, like the days of old. And so it was the ultimate sellout. And that's when punk, primarily, you know, your bigger, better names in punk, it got tainted, man. It went into warrant land, you know,
like everything does.
Yeah, Cherry Pie.
It's a sad story, but
it was. But there was a lot of bands making Cherry Pie at that particular moment, and, you know, unfortunately, there's a lot of bands, except for your occasional, you know, county fair, you know, appearance. There's a lot of those bands escape my memory at the moment. I know they had some hits, but I'm struggling to remember what some of these bands were, you know, and who they are now.
Hell yeah.
So yeah, it really is. It's so strange to live in this day and age and see the death of genres.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, really,
they typically always come back though.
Well, yeah, but I mean, but now when they come back, there's also this, you know, production technique that you got to use to make sure that it gets enough streams, or it hits a certain, you know what I'm saying? There's a sheen that's put over everything now. And you know, that's why it's really a really big thing, even though I can't stand him, but it's a really big thing when a guy like Jack White decides to, you know, well, let's go ahead and take this thing all the way back to analog and preserve the whole analog process up to and including releasing the medium on an analog format, whether it be, you know, a vinyl or cassette. has that booth up there that you can sit in and make your own record and record your own record in real time.
I'm not going to be impressed until they start pressing 8-tracks again. That's just me.
I don't know, man. I really, and it's gotten to the point, just like with our money too, that the removal of the actual physical format. And that's why it's been so great to see vinyl make the comeback that it has. And it doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon.
No, I mean, you can find that shit in Walmart's got a little section. People buy that shit. They on the regular.
I buy that shit. Hell, I made an order to, I'm a huge Guided by Voices collector, and God help you if you want to get into that. Because there are literally Guided by Voices proper. The band Guided by Voices has, 40 albums, 30 or 40 albums now. And then if you want to get everything that Bob Pollard's ever done, you're going to be looking for over 100 different albums. And then you get into the 45s. And if you really want to get nerdy about it, then you start getting all the CD copies, and you get it in every medium you can get it in. And these guys are nuts. Their one album, Propeller, I just saw go for an auction, and this was not even the highest that I've seen it go for. Just sold for $6,000.
Damn.
Yeah, because there's only 500 copies of it, and they all hand did each and every cover. All the members of the band at that time. Yeah.
Well, you know what we're going to have to do a segment on, guys? We've never covered the Ruddles, ever.
The Ruddles was killer.
They were, man.
I need to go back and watch that again. And that it's so bizarre that the songs that they parody are almost as good as the songs.
All you need is cash,
dude. And I mean, and they're up there nailing that shit too, and nailing the harmonies. And I mean, and it's not just a note for note imitation. It's their own, that's the Beatles. Alan Klein's gonna sue your ass in the Neverland.
They did it with straight face too. They never cracked a smile.
No, and why should they? Because they were being serious about that. That was a serious band.
No, what we probably need to do sometime is count down the greatest fictional bands.
Yep.
Oh man,
Spinal Tap.
Spinal Tap's going to win. Yeah, Spinal Tap's going to win that one. That's not much of a contest for the other participants. Even the Ruddles, if the Ruddles are able to make two, that's great and all. But Spinal Tap's won.
Oh yeah,
yeah. There's no way.
All right,
Mitch and Mickey are in my top 10.
Oh, that's a good one, and the Folksmen.
The Monkees.
Well, I mean, but the Monkees, if you want to start splitting hairs, the Monkees were a real band.
They were finally, but
they went on tour. They toured with Hendrix, dude.
Not out of the gate, though.
No, they didn't. Not out of the gate. But they actually had some musicians there, and everybody stepped up and learned to play their instrument, and they all went and performed. Wrote music together and shit. So they were a real band. They may have started off as a fictional band, but the life imitating art.
Milli Vanilli.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now we're getting somewhere with this one.
And the Partridge Family. God damn it! All right, Kyle's out of here. That was our cue that this episode's over.
Excellent. Later, guys.
Later.